Hello, my self-actualized art sluts. It's Allison Moon, and you are listening to the Artgasm Podcast, the podcast all about the intersections of sex and art. I am thrilled that you are joining me today on week 11 billion of social isolation. I hope that you are doing all right, and I hope that you are indulging in art and sexuality to the degree that your brain can handle right now. And it's actually quite lovely because this episode I recorded a long time ago, like a weirdly long time ago. I was at a conference with a friend sitting on her hotel bed in a casino. There was so much interaction this weekend, and it was fun to listen to this interview as I was editing it and just remembering what life was like a year ago being in Las Vegas with friends. But what was lovely about this conversation is that it's with an old friend named Rachel Gold, and we'll talk about the context of our friendship on the interview. But I loved this conversation because it stemmed from, at least the second half of the conversation stemmed from a conversation she and I were having in private before we sat down to actually record this interview. And in that conversation, Rachel mentioned neurodiversity and kind of talked to me about my sense of neurodiversity or neuroatypicality or however you want to call it. And I really appreciated the timing of this episode in my new season because I think it speaks to what I think a lot of us are experiencing now. We're starting to understand our brains a little bit more, particularly as we relate to this extended period of social isolation, how we are coping and how our coping mechanisms are complicated and challenging, which is a segue into just a little pitch for my Patreon. So I have been doing a couple of quickies this new season for the general public, but I've decided to move those behind the paywall at Patreon for my own mental health purposes. So if you liked those quickies, if you'd like to hear more of them, you can listen by becoming a Patreon. And at the new members, you can become a Patreon supporter at the $3 a month level. Or more, of course. And that just really does go to help offset the costs of putting this whole show together and making sure that I can sustain this effort throughout all of this era of work being a challenging, complicated thing. So there's that. So check out Patreon. I'm recording a new episode for my patrons only about self-care and eroticism. So I'm excited about that concept, and I think it's really becoming more and more relevant as we become more and more adept at understanding how our brains are relating to these new times. And finally, one more little announcement before I get to the bulk of the show, which is that I have only 5 hardcover copies of Girl Sex 101 left. So I created a limited edition run of Girl Sex 101. It's the original text. So I have did a couple of changes in the ensuing years. This is the original text, but it has a special preface written specifically for the hardcover books. Every copy is numbered and signed and personalized by me and sent to you with a beautiful letterpress bookmark. And you can also have the option to upgrade it to a mystery toy upgrade, which has been really fun. So if you're interested, this is really going to be your last chance. And I do have a 15% off discount going on at girlsex101.com throughout, as basically as long as I can handle during all of this quarantining. So if you are interested, you can get those books for 15% off by using the coupon Stay Home at girlsex101.com. And again, there are only 5 copies in the world left, and I'm not going to be reprinting these. These are limited edition, 50 copies only in the world. So if you'd like one, this is your last chance. Go to girlsex101.com and go ahead and grab one while the getting is good. All right. Now let me introduce you to Rachel Gold. So Rachel Gold is an old friend, and you'll hear that in our conversation. It's really fun to have conversations, especially on this podcast, with people I know very well, because as much as I enjoy interviewing people, I just really enjoy just talking to people and having just kind of chit chat. And this is what Rachel and I do because we love talking about giant concepts as casual conversation. It's kind of my jam. I love big talk, and I love talk about giant concepts around sex and art and existence. And so Rachel and I just, of course, dive in as effortlessly as one can because we have that relationship. And this was a delightful, delightful time to share with her. So you'll hear that. And we also talk about her novels, of which there are many, and they are great. So I'm just going to stop babbling and let you hear for yourself. So without further ado, allow me to introduce you to Rachel Gold.
All right, well, you start over.
Rachel Gold.
Hello.
Hi.
Happy to be here.
Okay, so when the recording was not working, I gave a little context for our friendship. So let's just do it again.
Yeah, perfect.
So I met you when I had written the lesbian werewolf novels, and I was going to like fantasy and sci-fi cons for feminists and queer women, and basically that world of this very rich world of like
so good, yeah.
Yeah, queer women, NBs and people who are really into sci-fi fantasy and approach sci-fi fantasy from the perspective of queerness and gender nonconformity and stuff, which, there's a significant overlap there.
Yeah, sure.
But at that time, you weren't, the books that you had written then, or the books that you were writing then weren't sci-fi fantasy, right?
No, that's the funny story of my publishing life is actually I wrote 3 urban fantasy novels. Didn't sell them. Wrote a young adult story about a trans girl, sold that one.
Wow.
And so since then, I went back and sold a couple of my urban fantasy novels under another name. But my main Rachel Gold publishing brand has been realistic young adult novels, which is not what it's not what I set out to do, but I love it.
Yeah. So Being Emily is about a trans girl. And you said it's the first...
It's the first young adult novel to tell the story of a trans girl from her perspective. So there were other novels with important trans girl characters, but they weren't in the mind of the trans girl. And I think it gave this sense of like there's this gulf, like, oh, trans people are so like mystical and ununderstandable. And I wanted to just close that and be like, no, like anybody can understand why a trans girl would be like, I'm a girl, let me be a girl. And I think it does that.
So, my question, like my fear would be, like you're not a trans woman.
Yeah.
So how, like, were you afraid of misrepresenting or having people mad at you because you're not a trans woman writing this book? Like, did you encounter any of that either externally or internally?
Some of each, for sure. And I wrote it. Like, I think I started drafting it in 2004.
Oh, wow.
So, and I was my partner at the time was a trans woman. I was very in the trans community, which I still am. And I was just mad that that this book didn't exist. So I was like, I'm going to write this.
Yeah.
And I did not imagine it would still be the first. I started in 2004. It came out in 2012.
Wow.
So, like, 8 years later, it was still the first. I thought someone would have beat me to it by then.
Wow.
Yeah, so I hadn't planned that. And also the funny thing is last year I got to re-release it in an expanded edition. And like having explored my gender more and now that non-binary is an option and seeing all of that, I could see how like, oh, I do have gender dysphoria. Like this is part of how I could write this is like I do know what gender dysphoria feels like. I do know what it feels like to have a mismatch between how people see you and how you know yourself to be. It's just not exactly the same as for trans women, but it's adjacent. So that could help me sort of bridge into that world and bring other people into that world. And I like to think that Being Emily being published actually opened the door for more novels by trans women writers with trans women main characters.
That's awesome.
Thanks.
Groundbreaking.
I hope so.
Yeah. And then, so tell me about like the books that followed that up.
Sure. So I often say that Being Emily is kind of like Trans 101. It's got all the basics. It's the classic coming out story. And then I wanted to do advanced trans feminism. I read some Julia Serrano, and I was like, oh yes, like I want the novel version of this. So Just Girls takes place on a college campus, and one of the main characters is friends with Emily and Claire from Being Emily. So she's a cis girl, but knows all the trans politics and is the trans feminist. And she shows up for college first year, and there's these mean girls trash talking that there's a trans girl in the dorms and just being shitty about it. So Tucker, this character, comes out as if she's the trans girl, even though she isn't.
So she's like taking the heat kind of
exactly,
situation? Oh, wow.
Exactly. And you probably don't remember, I borrowed your hair from WisCon back in the day when you had the mohawk at WisCon.
You borrowed my hair?
Yeah,
what does that mean?
Yeah, I said, can I use your hair for Tucker? So Tucker's got the big mohawk. Yeah. So
was it hot pink? Because I think I had a hot pink mohawk at that time.
No, it was bleach white.
Oh, God, yeah. I've had so much hair over the years.
Yes, because I was sitting behind you at one point at WisCon, and I was like, that would look so good on a character.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, yes, so Tucker has your hair.
And Tucker is my drag name.
Oh, I did not know that.
Yeah, Tucker Saxon.
Wow.
Yeah.
We have a good psychic link.
Yeah, it's kind of freaky.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay.
Huh. Cool. So Tucker comes out as a trans girl, even though she isn't. And meanwhile, Ella, the actual trans girl, ends up meeting Tucker and they become friends before Ella comes out. And then obviously Ella comes out to her. And a lot of the story is about kind of Tucker dealing with the violence she didn't expect to get. And then Ella's arc is about this cute boy. Because I was like, the trans character gets to have an arc that's just a romance arc about a cute boy.
Nice.
And then I heaped a lot of stuff on Tucker, which I only feel a little guilty about.
Well, I mean, I think that's the challenge about, any sort of art form around queer and trans characters is that you're often, you're often dealing with trauma and big things and drama and all these intense things because that's what makes story often.
Right.
But then you get into this problem of, killing off the gay characters or, what trauma do you put on certain characters? And when all the narratives in a certain, genre are about how hard it is to be trans or how, miserable it is to try and be a lesbian in a conservative place or whatever, then it becomes just kind of just torture.
Yeah.
And to read it is not fun, or you get deluged with just the one narrative as opposed to can't trans girls just have a cute love story?
Right.
And can't, lesbians just have some sort of badass thing that has nothing to do with sex?
Right.
And oftentimes we don't have enough narratives to be able to allow for expansion of stories. I remember I had this issue in my second werewolf novel, I kill off a character at the end, one of the members of the pack. And it was my editor, but I originally killed off this one character, and my editor was like, you can't kill off the only bisexual in the pack. And I'm like, that is true.
Yeah.
Shit. And then so I kill off this other character, and she was the only femme in the pack. Or the only high femme in the pack,
yeah.
and the maternal one. And I got an angry letter from somebody who was upset at me for killing the femme. And I explained to them, well, here's the story of how that happened. And this felt where it was narratively closes her arc, and that makes sense to remove the mother figure from this group of women. Okay, so I kind of explained it. And the woman wrote back saying, I totally understand. I just felt really emotionally connected to that character. And, I still have a lot of, she didn't use the word trauma, but it's coming, I still have a lot of bad feelings about killing off Amber Benson's character in Buffy.
Oh.
I can't remember the name of the character. Because she was the maternal femme, or, Earth Mother.
Yeah.
And so that was just felt to her very similar. I'm killing off that same character.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm that's, again, but that's, for me, I can understand that from an emotional perspective. That also pisses me off because it means that we don't have enough queer characters, that we have so many to choose from, that a bunch of them get to live, and then we can kill off some of them without it meaning that, it has to be the same character getting killed off over and over again,
Yeah. And that's a general problem in plotting queer and trans books is if you you don't put violence in, and then people are like, that's unrealistic because so much violence happens. You put violence in, it's well, that's in all the books, you know, and it's well, crap, so I think certainly with Just Girls I tried to be okay, there's some violence, but we see them overcoming it, as opposed to in a lot of books where it beats the character down.
Right.
But yeah, we definitely need more where it's okay, we can kill someone off without repercussions.
Yeah, because it's kind of ironic because we're at Plexicon, right, which is a con that's named after a ship of a character that was killed on the show, and then that actually spurred the whole what is bury your gays kind of hashtag movement around just bringing awareness to how frequently the one queer character in the ensemble is killed off in service of the story, as though their character doesn't actually matter as anything other than fodder for drama. Yeah,
and we should probably say Clark and Lexa from The 100 for people who don't know who Lexa is.
Yeah.
Exactly. And also, it's... I was thinking, even I've been watching Runaways, and the fact that Gert and what's that guy's name, the guy that she's with, they have sex in early, but the Carolina and Nico kiss chastely.
Yeah.
And I was so there's the thing where the lesbian gets killed off, or the lesbians are together in a soft, cuddly, and I'm there's just, I could use more.
Well, that's, and again, for me, my werewolf books are not YA. My werewolves fuck. And so that was new adult, right? So that was the genre that was very popular at the time. So for me, and this is as a sex educator, I think that one of the things I'm still encountering as I talk to, mainstream audiences about lesbians is that there's still this misunderstanding about how lesbians have sex. And because even when Hollywood depicts lesbians, which it rarely does, a lot of the times it's soft kissing and scissoring. And it's just this is obviously like a straight man's idea of what lesbian sex is like. And I'm like, I want to make sure that I write books where lesbians fuck. Like, fuck. Yes. And it drives me crazy when I see just, again, like soft lighting, soft kissing, just touching, and it's all very like, I don't know, like Cinemax After Dark, kind of like, it's just not fucking. And I want to let people know, I want to educate people, because that's what I do for a living, but like, I want to show people like how women can get each other off in really diverse kind of ways.
Yes.
And that's just kind of my own mission.
That's a great mission. That's a fantastic mission. Yes. I feel like our cousins, the bonobos, pioneered that.
Yeah, good job, bonobos. Thanks, guys.
Yes. Okay, I'm going to segue to my next book, actually, with that. So in My Year Zero, which is my third novel, I like, in the middle of the book, there is an explicit sex scene between these two 16-year-olds that is accidentally hot, but I did not set out to make it. I set out to make it awkward, but some people are like, that's hot. I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah. Because I also wanted to show that, like, sometimes teenagers who are girls just have sex with each other.
Right.
Like, and it's not, there isn't like, let's date for a while then cuddle, and then we're gonna make out 3 times. It's just like, we're friends. Okay, now we're on the floor having sex.
Huh.
You know?
That's great.
Yeah, and also at 16, that's really confusing. So that was kind of the fun for me with the main character. She comes out of it really confused, but also like, okay, that was amazing, and what? Like, what just happened to me?
It's so interesting.
You know, because she's a little disconnected from her own emotional, so she doesn't realize that she loves this girl as much as she does, and then suddenly they're just having sex. And the thing is, like, I hadn't seen that with lesbians. Like, I've seen it, well, lesbians and bi women, because one of the women is bi. Like, I've seen it with hetero couples, you know, like even in Runaways. Like, suddenly they're having sex. But, like, that happens with girls, too.
Right.
And you just really don't see it very much.
Well, yeah, because, again, it perpetuates this myth that girls aren't as sexual as boys, that we don't have just the same animal desire to just fuck that boys do.
Yeah.
And I think that's a problematic myth that we need to dispel for sure.
For sure. And I was reading the book Untrue by Wednesday Martin, which has been lovely. But it's funny because, you know, and in it she's building the case, which a lot of the current good sex books do, about, you know, that female desire is as strong as male desire. And my thing is, when do we get to stop saying female and male desire and just be like, humans like sex?
Yes.
Human beings tend to like sex. Some don't. It's great if you're ace. Totally cool. Many humans like sex.
Yeah.
This does not actually have to be like
a gendered thing. Male
and female desire are so different. They aren't.
No.
People like sex.
Yeah. I get that a lot from the sex education side of things. Like, men are visual and women are auditory, and it's just like, I mean, and then this becomes like, is it descriptive or is it prescriptive? Because, you know, and it's, for me, I just, as an observer of sexuality, just like, oh yeah, people subtly or overtly try to fit themselves in the boxes that scientists say we are.
Yeah.
And so if I want to be a good woman, now I have to appreciate the way that somebody whispers in my ear. I have to make sure that the room looks the right way or something, because that's what the average woman likes, quote unquote. And that drives me fucking nuts, because it's like, well, are you sure? Or the ways we study sex are so limited by sample size, by society, by anxiety, and by self-reporting. And so it's like, you can't actually often figure out how, like, the quote unquote female brain or the male brain receives shit.
Right, because those don't actually exist. Like, there aren't actually female and male brains. Right. And to me, it's like, that's not the most meaningful category.
Right.
You know, a more meaningful category is, like, I think age is a much more meaningful category in the ways that people have sex than, you know, gender.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So, speaking of age, I'm curious, when you talked about how that sex scene turned out to be hot, like, does that raise any conflict for you to, like, write scenes where teenagers are having hot sex? Like, are there standards in the YA world that you can't talk about certain things, or?
I have my own internal standards, and there's actually a book called Harmful to Minors that's about, like, how to talk about sex, having to do with teens, and I read a good white paper about this as well, because I'm kind of a geek.
Yeah. I've read Harmful to Minors. It's great.
Yeah. And you know, so generally, my takeaway was that you know, adults will read sex scenes for arousal, like that's what erotica's for. Teens tend to read sex scenes for education, to see what their peers are doing, you know, to see what their options are. So generally, when I'm writing sex involving teens, I mean for it to be educational. If it also, like, if some people find it hot, fine.
Yeah.
Like, but I didn't set out to write a hot scene. I set out, and, you know, like, if you read it, you'll see, because there's plenty of awkwardness.
Yeah.
Like there's plenty of awkwardness going on, and the main character is very confused about what's happening in the first half of it, like because they go swimming and then they end up showering together, and then like they're still naked, and the main character, why are we naked? Like what's happening? What's going on? Like so there's a lot of this sense of confusion, and then part of what's important about the scene is that she's being seen for the first time. So like she's been having sex with someone else who doesn't see her, and that's not on the page because you wouldn't put that on the page because she's not being seen. And so what was important to me was she's working all these things out for herself. She has a lot of confused feelings, and she's suddenly realizing she hasn't been seen before. So I had to show that. So that's why the sex is there. So it wasn't like, I'm going to write you this hot sex.
Right.
It's like, I need you to see Lauren seeing herself as a sexual other. And like that's a moment where you start to become an adult, I think.
Yeah.
So that, in that sense, I'm not conflicted because I know what that scene was for and why it belonged in there. And all the scenes where I put explicit sex in a book are in there for a reason. You know, like in Nico Tucker, consent mechanics is in some of the scenes, or like dealing with trauma and sex and that stuff. So yeah, that's my feeling as a general. In YA, I hope authors know why a sex scene is in there, and it's not in there to arouse people, but it might because it's sex.
Right. That's interesting because one of the things that so Girl Sex 101 is like a sex ed book, but I wanted to start off every chapter with an erotica scene, quote unquote, that demonstrates the things that you're about to learn. Specifically because at that point when I was writing it, 50 Shades of Grey was huge, and people were reading it as a textbook, right? Which is damaging and problematic. There are a lot of BDSM books that are actual textbooks and that do a better job. That's my little disclaimer. But like, it made me realize, I'm like, that what you just said, that people read erotica, depending on where they are in their lives, for educational purposes, to figure out how things work. And so I'm like, oh, okay, so this is an opportunity to write scenes in which you're seeing characters negotiate sex or try new things or stop and have a conversation in the middle. And, you know, some of the critiques I've gotten from the book is that, well, the sex scenes didn't do anything for me. Which I'm like, fine. That's not what they were there for, you know. And if you do find them hot, Yahtzee, but ultimately, like, wasn't my goal. My goal was to remediate information in a different format so that people might be able to relate to it differently and learn more things that they might not learn from a didactic chapter.
Right. Well, and I thought that was a very smart move on your part to put those in there. And I'm going to say there's at least one. I can't remember which one where I was like, oh, that's how that's done. Oh. Like where I was reading one of the fictional, and I was like, oh, that's how you do it. Okay, good.
What was it?
I don't know. I'll tell you what. I'll figure it out.
I'm so curious.
I know. It was probably flirting. I mean, it's probably something like that. Seriously. That's how that's done. Damn. If only I'd known. But I think also because we're human beings and like the way mirror neurons work and stuff, when we're reading fiction, when we're reading about people doing something, we mirror it to ourselves more than when we read nonfiction. Yeah. So I think it's super helpful to see these things in scene and to picture them in scene.
Yeah, and the intimacy, again, like, you know, I enjoy watching films and I enjoy listening to podcasts, but ultimately I think that there's something so intimate about reading that cannot be replicated by other formats of, again, like, and being able to get inside the points of view, being able to talk about the complexity and the inner turmoil that somebody might be experiencing, and to, again, like, it's an exercise in empathy, right? So like really listen to like, oh, I wouldn't feel that way if I was in that situation, but I understand now how somebody could, and that's a hugely educational thing by itself, beyond the mechanics of tab A slot B, about like, oh, that makes sense why that would occur in that way.
Yeah. Definitely. And I think you get really specific when you have to be specific when you're doing like two people talking in a dialogue, as opposed to, you know, sometimes you'll see things about sex where it's like, make sure you get consent, and you're like, I don't know what that means. Like, what do I actually say out of my mouth to do that? Right. But when you see a scene of two people checking in with each other, it's like, oh, okay, like that's doable.
Yeah. I mean, we were just having a conversation about before we started recording about YA and consent conversations, and I thought it was really interesting to talk about like the way in which we separate consent as though it's this other thing that happens outside of sex. Yeah. And if you don't do it right, you will ruin sex and you'll hurt somebody. Yeah. Right? As opposed to just another aspect of like maximizing pleasure, understanding our own motivations, like. exploring our own inner landscape of things. Like, all of this is actually what consent is. And unfortunately, the word itself is not nearly evocative enough to be able to encapsulate all of the nuances of what consent is and does. And I think it's one of my frustrations with the word consent, because, like, it's so clinical, and it means to, like, request something of somebody and have them agree.
Yeah.
Which isn't sexy.
Yeah. It is not. It is not. And it's, so my latest novel, which is coming out in May, In the Silences, my main characters, who are 14 and 15, because the novel spans a little time, use a lot of superhero metaphors. And so I was just thinking, like, in a counterpoint to consent, like, a lot of times when I meet people, I ask what superhero they are. Like, if you're familiar with Marvel fandom, like, what hero are you? Because it tells me so much about the person. But it's also, like, that, in a sense, is where I would want consent mechanics to move to, like, this whole person view, where it's not, oh, you agreed to something. It's like, what do you love? What are you curious about? What are you craving? What are you hoping will happen later? You know, it gives the whole world of it. And sometimes, you know, the beauty of superhero metaphors or gender metaphors is sometimes you can package that in a really neat package, where it's like, oh, let's do this thing where, like, you're Captain America and I'm the Hulk, or whatever. I made this up. Those are not our heroes. Just listeners, those are not our heroes.
What is your hero? Wait, did you tell me this yesterday?
Oh, yeah. Well, a number of... so I have so many of them that the joke is I'm secretly Mystique.
Oh, right.
Right? Because I'm the shapeshifter, and I'm everybody else, too. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
I appreciate that.
But I think, but that kind of whole person view, I think, is where I hope consent conversations go to.
Like alignments, kind of?
Yes.
Yeah.
Like, so, you're neutral evil. My safe word is.
It's so interesting, because, like, you were one of the first people I knew who really did, like, any sort of, like, role-playing games and like World of Warcraft stuff. And again, this was a whole thing for me for entering into the sci-fi fantasy world of, like, this is a very rich culture. And I remember being so interested in, because you had this, you almost, like, had frameworks, and I think probably because of that world, the gaming world, like, you had frameworks for alignments, you had frameworks for, you know, your powers and your weaknesses and these character sheets.
Yes, exactly. And it's and, like, character classes is another thing. Because I think you notice, like, at conventions, I'll ask people, like, what are your fandoms? Like, oh, if you play games, what classes do you play? Because I'm basically asking people for their archetypes, like their psychological archetypes. And it's a neat way to know a lot about a person pretty quickly, which, as an introvert, I appreciate, because then it's like, okay, now we're one-to-one related. I can have a conversation with you.
I really like hearing that, because I think that there's this notion on kind of the outside world, or the mainstream, or whatever you want to call it, that, like, fandom is kind of this, like, pathetic, like, you know, like, just you don't have your own life, so you need to subsume your identity into somebody else's, right? And, like, that's a very harsh way of saying it, but I think that, like there are some people who just don't understand the Comic-Con world, or people who don't understand fandom in general, and the way you described it is, I think, is really elegant, where it's like, by learning about somebody's, like, not just likes or dislikes, but resonances, like the characters, the situations that, like, work for them, you can learn so much about who they are as a person in a really short time. And I think for me, that's one of my that's what the hard thing for me is to, like, really, I feel like I need to spend a lot of time with somebody before I actually understand how their brain works. And that's hard for me, because it becomes like, well, I can still say something, I can say the wrong thing after I've known somebody for 6 months. And that's a hard place to be. And I mean, we can all say the wrong thing to somebody after knowing somebody for 20 years. But your ability to kind of use shorthand, avatars, all that, like, archetypes, I think is a lovely way of saying it too. I think is a really cool way of just talking about, like, intimacy and understanding people through, like, these really basic personalities. And I think that's really fun. I want to explore more of that.
We'll totally do that. And also, you know, so I teach a class for teens, 13 to 17, and I talk to teens a lot because I write YA fiction, and it becomes a way, particularly to help teens who are geeks, to persevere. You know, so there are a lot of times when I've got, you know, whether it's in my class, and I've got a teen who's kind of acting out in my class, I can appeal to their hero archetype. You know, where it's like, okay, I know you're the demon sorcerer. You know, so you got to work on your discipline, otherwise your demons are going to get loose. You know, like, it gives me a way to kind of come into their world, you know, or, like, working, like, talking to trans teens and being like, okay, I know you're in a tough situation because you can't be out at school. So what hero could be on an undercover mission. Like, what hero could you be on an undercover mission in your school right now that would make this okay for you?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah, talk about resilience.
Exactly.
Oh, that's amazing. Because I think that, again, from the outside, we all know that the X-Men metaphor is it's
it's
the metaphor
queerness,
for,
it's transness, yeah.
It's pretty obvious, but being able to dive deeper into joyousness around taking something on, and I think that almost everybody I know who was a comic book nerd when they were young took that stuff on.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that the reason why the Spider-Man quote has lingered in society so much is that people really do believe now great power, great responsibility.
Yes.
And I think that some of the most righteous human beings I know live that way.
Yeah.
And I think that's really lovely.
Yeah, and the other thing I love, because I think a lot of us grew up on similar comics, so we have this in the background. Now we're seeing them in the movies because some of us who grew up on the comics are making the movies.
Right.
It also is such a beautiful model for diversity when you have a really functional superhero team, because you've got these and neurodiversity, which of course I love. You've got people with very different abilities and very different weaknesses coming together to support each other to do the best with their strengths and shore up each other's weaknesses.
Yes.
And I think that's just a better way to have a society.
Yeah.
Rather than, I don't know, sports metaphors, I guess.
Right. And still seeing you can fight with each other.
Right.
And you can insult each other, and you can still, and you can take responsibility, and you can still come together at the end as a family and as a team. And I think that that's a really important thing for young people to understand.
Yes.
It's okay to fight, it's okay to disagree, but taking responsibility for the harm that you do, and then trying to find some place to arrive at together is the point.
Yes, and especially for teens who are. Unlike neurodiverse teens, who I know plenty of,
right?
Where it's okay, you may have this very sense of inconsistent power. You're incredibly good at a few things, and you're pretty bad at a bunch of other things. And the bunch of other things are things that other people look like they're good at. So you feel like you're not as good as other people, even though you have these two things you're amazing at.
Right.
What I love about superheroes is that's very much the case. It's well, Bruce Banner's not great at controlling the Hulk, but he's amazing as the Hulk.
Yeah.
He's got his bad moments. He's got a bunch of stuff he can't do, and if he can't transform into the Hulk, he's pretty weak.
Yeah.
He has all these weaknesses, but he also occasionally can just show up and save the day.
Yeah.
Because he is incredibly good at one thing, which is Hulk smash.
Right.
Yeah. So I think it's a good model for us understanding that all human beings have weaknesses, and we can have some pretty intense weaknesses, and that doesn't mean we're not also amazing heroes.
Yeah, and kind of back to the character sheets of you can't have a useful. I was gonna try and use the D&D word, but
party.
Yeah. Well, I was gonna say the actual task. What's the when you actually do the expedition or whatever?
Quest, adventure.
Quest. Yeah. Thank you. You can't have a useful quest if you don't have weaknesses.
Yeah.
It's actually and then this is what I've never really enjoyed Superman. Again, Superman has one weakness that we're all familiar with. But I think that being too good at too many things is not interesting and not human.
Yeah.
And I think that it's really nice to be reminded that to be a human is to have things that you are just not good at, and it's really helpful to be surrounded by loving people who are good at those things.
Right.
And then you can send them in to smash when you're not a smasher.
Right. Because if you had a team that was 6 Hulks, that would be a problem.
Right. Right. Planet Hulk, challenging.
Yes. not gonna save New York from aliens, really.
Right.
Not gonna do that. So so you need these different powers, you need different weaknesses. Yeah. I mean, we have different weaknesses, so
yeah, that's true.
We might as well have fun with them.
Yeah, it's funny. So I was speaking to a little personal thing. Since yesterday, I have been reading a lot about ADHD. And I mentioned it on Twitter, and a bunch of my friends were like, one of us. And then also a bunch of my friends were like, I'm thinking that maybe I might do that too. And so I've been okay, so these are the things I've been learning so far. And again, I've been on this kind of introspection journey for the past couple of months. And I've never considered myself a very self-aware person, and so I'm well, this is the year that Allison Moon becomes self-aware. The AI suddenly reflects upon itself, and it's been really interesting for me because I've been writing my character sheet.
Oh, yes,
and that's been really cool to have this the things I took for granted that's just me, that's just who I am.
Yeah.
Suddenly I'm oh, I'm really good at this. Apparently this is a huge weakness that I did not know about, but now I know where it is, and now I know how to prevent it or avoid it or whatever. I feel that's I feel like a new sense of like strength for being able to identify things about myself that I had no idea about up until like, well, in this case, yesterday, but in the other cases, like a couple months ago, you know?
This is good, because for like 3 hours yesterday, I thought I had broken you.
No!
So I was like, oh, crap.
Yeah, so it's just for context. I know, I'm sorry if I'm missing. So basically, Rachel and I saw each other for the first time in like 5 years yesterday, and at lunch, Rachel just says like, oh, well, you know, you understand, because you're neuroatypical or neurodiverse. I can't remember which one.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I'm sorry, what now? And you're like, no, you know. And I'm like, what?
And then I was like, you have an ADHD brain same as me.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
and you were like, what?
and again, like, this is so funny because I studied neuroscience in college, but that was never something we really talked about. I skipped my abnormal psychology class because it was early in the morning. I always missed it because I'm not an early riser. But yeah, the idea of like when you hear hyperactive, you think this very specific set of things, and I'm like, I am very good at being idle. I am very good at being lazy, and so I'm like, I can't possibly be hyperactive. And then you're like, allow me to explain to you
Yes.
what the actual meanings of these are.
Right.
And so I took a test yesterday.
Oh, did you?
I scored 68%. Nice. Which I'm like, okay.
Well, welcome to the team. Well, and it's also, the cool thing is, it's actually, especially since we're talking about this in a gaming context, it's like getting your class. It's like, oh, you're a rogue too.
Yeah.
You know, and then you know what the rogue powers are and the rogue weaknesses.
Right.
You know, so, and that's how I look at neurodiversity, is like, you know, if you have an ADHD type brain, or if you have a autism spectrum type brain, that it's not a disability. Obviously for some people it is, so I don't want to erase that. Because that is a very broad group of people, and that's a very rich topic. But one way to look at it is, you got your character class. Like, now you know what your special abilities are, and now you know where you need extra help. You know, and the neurotypical people are probably the barbarians. I'm gonna guess.
Yeah, it's funny because like my girlfriend used to talk about, because she was a D&D player, and she was like, oh yeah, what's your class? I'm like, I don't know. And even when she would describe it, like, I know what excites me, but that doesn't mean who I am.
Right.
And like, I know that I'd like to think of myself as, I don't know, or in the comic book, we're like, oh yeah, everybody wants to be Jean Grey, but nobody really wants to be Jean Grey.
Right.
So it's like, you know, it's interesting, and like nobody necessarily, it's a different thing to be excited about something or attracted to something versus what actually resonates with you as an identity. Yeah. And so that's been interesting. Now that I feel like I have a little bit more insight, I'm like, okay, now I can go back to those classes and be like, like, I'd like to think I'm a mage. I'm not a mage.
Yeah. I don't know. We could be mages. I mean, I just picked rogue off the top of my head.
Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, I'm pretty sure we're not the barbarians.
Probably not.
No. And well, I don't know what what classes our system has. I mean, I'd like to open up like engineer to mage also for the autism spectrum folks.
Oh, okay.
I think that's a good. You know.
Yeah, it's funny too, because like I've always considered people on the autism spectrum to be like, again, like Asperger's and all this, like, to be superpowers. I've always been like, oh my God, how cool would it be to be able to see the world that way? And because for me, I knew that I didn't see the world that way, and I envied that. And I think it's funny now to be like, oh, okay, like, this is where, like, it's kind of like identity labels with queerness. Like, a lot of people, they figure out that they're trans or NB or gay or, you know, whatever, and that word, owning that word, opens up this whole new realm of understanding themselves and other people. Whereas for, you know, some people it can be deeply confusing and hard. But I think that, like, people underestimate the power of those labels. And the labels can be limiting, and they can sometimes make people feel like they have to shrink themselves into those labels, and that's not necessarily a good use of them. But, like, as I was saying, talking to my friend on Twitter about, like, oh yeah, like, ADHD, blah, 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 I had a friend kind of chime in and be like, I want you guys to know I love you just as you are, and, like, you don't have to, like, you can go on your path, but, like, please don't feel like you have to change yourselves. And I'm like, oh my God, hun, totally appreciate you saying that. Not at all the point. Like, my point is, like, now there are all these new ways I can understand myself and people around me. But I think there is this kind of, like, the doom and gloom diagnosis of disorder that you were kind of saying, like, this is not a disorder, this is mutant superpowers.
Right.
If you frame it that way, like, everything's better.
Yeah. And I think also, I mean, I want to put in that it can be really hard. I mean, like, you do not know how many times I've burst into tears about paperwork. Because, like, my ADHD brain cannot get paperwork. So I will just sit at my desk and cry. And then try to get help. And, you know, I've been lucky that I've worked in a work environment for a lot of years at the marketing firm I worked at, where they were very willing to work with, like, what is easy for me and what's hard for me. And happily, the things that are easy for me that I'm great at are things they needed me to do. So I definitely, like, especially my friends who are on the spectrum, like, I see them get crushed against expectations of what they should do and break themselves thinking I should be able to do these neurotypical things. So it can be really hard, and that's what I love the X-Men metaphor for.
Yeah.
It's like, well, you're not gonna ask Wolverine to dust the X Mansion. Like, that's not his thing.
Yeah.
You're not gonna ask Wolverine to sit in class all day. So it gives you a better sense for, like, you're a hero and you have these weaknesses, and sometimes the weaknesses fucking hurt, and it's better if you call on your team than if you turn it in and try to break yourself on neurotypical expectations.
Yeah, I've been exploring that a lot because I have a day job now, and I hire people, and, like, being able, and it's tough with job stuff to not talk too much about things that are, you can't talk about during an interview, but, like, I've had some people disclose, like, that they have anxiety, and I'm like, that's cool, we can work with that, like, thanks for letting me know, like, and so being able to, and again, like, as a good employer, being able to speak up about, like, this is how we can make this work for everybody, this is how we can use your superpowers, and we can avoid your super weaknesses, and, like, and then everybody will be stronger because we know this body set, instead of everybody trying to fit themselves in the same exact box, which is what industrialization did to American society. And now that I think we're coming out of that, we have an opportunity to restructure the way we think about work and the way we think about brains and work.
Yeah, exactly. I had the marketing firm I worked for did the Gallup Poll Strengths Finder, which is like 34 areas of human strength, which also is a great way, like, if you don't want to use comic book metaphors, to talk about these 34 areas. Like, you and I probably share the strength ideation. We're really good at coming up with ideas. And I didn't realize that not everyone could do that.
Well, and that's where the whole self-awareness thing comes in. Like, oh, not everybody's good at that. I mean, that's how I discovered my sexuality. I was like, not everybody likes both boys and girls. When I was 14, I'm like, oh. But that was a giant revelation. And not because I kind of considered myself the neutral, but just because it just didn't occur to me that anybody would be not, because that seems like a great way to be.
Well, and I think everyone growing up is like, oh, like we're all some, and then you kind of get to discover how different you are.
Yeah.
But it's neat when you can have a language, so even if it's like, oh, I'm good at ideation, and someone else might be good at relatedness. So let's go network together, because you'll introduce yourselves to people and I'll come up with ideas for them.
Oh my God.
And then everyone will be delighted.
That's great. That describes why my partnership with my partner works so well. He's a relator.
Yeah.
He loves meeting people, connecting people, and then I love talking to them once we find similarities.
And it's it's another way to learn how to super team.
That's
with
awesome.
People with compatible strengths. Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
All right, well, we have to go to a panel now.
Yeah.
So, Rachel Gold, where can people find you in the world?
RachelGold.com is my website. Bella Books is my publisher, so you can buy my books there. And my books are, Amazon, IndieBound. You can request them at your library if they're not there. So
nice.
That's how to find me.
Yeah, and they're fun reads. They play with ideas, and there's beautiful language, and at the same time they're very accessible. So I love your writing.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yay!
Yay!
That was good. And that is it for this week's episode of Artgasm. As always, please do find me on the social medias or on the emails if you'd like to reach out to me. You can find me on Twitter at HeyAllieMoon. You can hashtag something ArtgasmCast and I will find it. You can email me at artgasmcast@gmail.com. And above all, if you like what you're hearing and you want to support me, you can become a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/artgasm. That's patreon.com/artgasm, which is ARTGASM. Until next time, please do stay safe. Please do continue to wash your hands and wear your masks and take care of each other and your community. We rely on one another, and it's helpful to be reminded about that in these times. So please do take care of yourself and everyone around us. We are all in this together, and it's helpful to be reminded of that. In these times, we are all going through this together, so do what you can to make sure that everyone has a little bit of a better day. All right, thanks so much. Bye-bye.